Right, let's look today at Exodus chapter 1. Let's look at Exodus chapter 1 from verse 1 through verse 14. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. 'Look,' he said to his people, 'the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country.' And so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the field. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly." And the title of today's message, we're going to find out about these midwives later, but the title of today's message is Shiprah and Puah, the midwives who feared God. So Shiprah and Puah, the midwives who feared God. So the book of Exodus is a very precious book in the Bible about the Israelites in Egypt, where God guided them out of Egypt, this place where they were enslaved, and he guided them out towards the promised land. In other words, for us, the people of this fallen world, we can think of that as we are God's people and we are going towards God's kingdom. So there is something where I need to leave this world. Of course, we need to leave the enslavement of this world, and we are God's people. With the promise for God's kingdom, we should walk towards God and his glory and his kingdom. So in the midst then of coming out of Egypt and going towards the promised land, what kind of message comes out? That's the book of Exodus. And so really today, beginning really with Exodus chapter 1, going towards that new hope, we find the wisdom that we need. And so we're going to see that through these midwives. Now first, before we do get to the midwives, we need to understand the circumstance and the situation. And so after Jacob and Joseph, we see that the families, grew, in number of God's people. Because of Joseph, remember Joseph was, appointed very highly in the land of Egypt. And so God's people, the Hebrew people, it records in the Bible, they, multiplied, they were fruitful, multiplied greatly, became exceedingly numerous within the land, right? And so that's our blessing as well too. God, his people, the people that live righteously, true, good for him, with faith in his Son Jesus Christ. As we live fruitfully in his kingdom, of course, God is going to bless us exceedingly. It's going to, bless us in many ways. And so, this is how we, it should be, right? The blessing of God in our life. But as God's people become fruitful and exceedingly numerous, the circumstance that we see here is that the Egyptian Pharaoh and the wise men want to deal very shrewdly with God's people, right? And so they want to deal with them very shrewdly. And so what do they do in order to really tamp down on this fruitfulness and how they're growing. They put slave masters oppressing them, working them ruthlessly and making their life very bitter like this. This is what we just read, and this is what Exodus records. And so, as you look at this situation, you really come to reflect on the exact situation of God's people as we live in this world also. We come to face the same thing. We receive the grace of Jesus Christ in our life, and so we should be the ones that live free in the Lord and in the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, becoming fruitful, becoming fruits of love, living. That's what we're here for. We're walking in this lifetime towards eternal life. And so there is this time that we're here, this temporary time that we're here on earth, and God wishes for us, and He calls us to live gracefully and fruitfully, and we are the people of love in the freedom of Jesus Christ. But what happens, though, the reality of God's people that are inside of this fallen world is that rather than being free in Jesus Christ, all kinds of responsibilities in the world come in. Right? This is what happens inside of the world. The world wishes to do this, put the burden of all kinds of worldly responsibilities upon us and working us ruthlessly, enslaving us. And so, you really see this in the world, right? How many of us are enslaved to the things of this world, to society or jobs or careers or societal expectations and all of these things. And what happens is that it makes life very bitter, right? What should be very enjoyable, we should live a joyful life. I think that is how God created us, to really live in this Garden of Eden, in this world that we are in, very joyfully. But rather, everything that we do in the world seems like a burden. It just seems very bitter. All the things that, just seem like responsibilities are burdens piling upon us. In fact, you come to find that this is how actually this fallen world is structured. The world is structured in a way, systematically, in this fallen world with sin, so we don't have time to pursue God. We don't have time to give worship to God. Worshiping God is instead something secondary. I have first and most primary, I have my responsibilities inside of the world. And so, look at what the Pharaoh and the slave masters are exactly doing to God's people. The God's people who should live and worship Him freely and live joyfully and blessed in that way. Rather, there's more and more slave masters and responsibilities and all kinds of things that burden them down. But, I don't want to just look at this, one-dimensionally, even just in terms of, simple work. Right? Because, even in God's kingdom, we have responsibilities and, we have diligence, and these are virtues in the Bible as well also. But, we do see that, in this lifetime, God, as we go forward and, being God's people, really being in this world, other kinds of issues, impact us as well too. Something strikes us, whether it be family or it could even be health. It's not just work, but it's many, many other things that, put, these burdens on us. And so, you look at the apostle as well too. The apostle Paul, he said we are hard pressed on every side. And so, the person who lives and runs and works for God's kingdom, the reality of the apostle was that it wasn't that he could just freely, do missions and, preach, God's name from city to city, but he was burdened with many things. In fact, he had to do tent making, by himself, but along with that, he was persecuted, stoned, he was, put in jail, and all kinds of things happened to the apostle as well, too. And so this is why, he writes that we are hard-pressed on every side. And so, when you really see the burdens that the Egyptians are putting on God's people, you really come to see how Satan does the same thing. He tries to do everything possible to keep us, block our relationship with God. While our life should be a living sacrifice in a relationship with God, what we come to find is that Satan tries everything possible in order to keep us away, block us, right? Block us. And why? Because, we are becoming fruitful. It's like the time that we are becoming more fruitful, things are working out, and we're praising God, we're maturing and growing in faith, and God's people all together too are growing in faith like that. Satan tries everything possible to really block God's people from having that loving and eternal relationship with God. He puts burdens on us from the world. And so, this is what Pharaoh and the wise men, they conspire, right, in order to block this fruitfulness, right? And so we really feel that as we read this. But what it records here, though, so even though this happened, right, even those that they put more burdens on them, what we just read was that in verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And so that's why, they put even more on, but, we can't forget this middle verse, right in the midst of what we see. And so, already Pharaoh and the wise men have already come up with this plan, but something amazing happens. The Israelites, they are oppressed, and they still even continue to multiply and spread. And so it's very mysterious. That's not something you think would ordinarily happen, right, in that circumstance, in that situation, right? I mean, you would think, like, how can I, really be fruitful and increase in number? How can I worship God? How can I do these things if, I'm burdened with many responsibilities inside of the world? You wouldn't think that you would have time to do these things. That's not something to be fruitful and increase in number and multiply and continue for God's people to do this. It's not something you would ordinarily expect under human power and our own ability. By human ability, it's a simple math, right? I mean, if you're really, really busy in one area, then what you're doing is you're taking time from this other area, and so you can't be fruitful in that other area, right? So if we have to be fruitful under the slave labor of this world, then because I'm devoting and spending my time being fruitful in this one area, then really spending my time with God and being fruitful in the love of God, I can't be both. You're taking from one in order to be fruitful in the other. This is what you would ordinarily expect. And so, this is a long time ago when I was a college student, I thought I had like these buckets of time. I imagined, my life, I had like 3 basically different buckets of my time. I can put my time here, here, or here. And so I had 3 in total. So one was study, right? And so you have your study time for your academics and all of that. That was one bucket. And then you had this bucket right here. This is a different bucket. So this was for, social life, activities, things, extracurricular things I want to do beyond studying to really enrich my life, right? And then this is, by the way, before I became a believer. And then, so that's 1 and that's 2. And then the third was sleep, right? And so you need time to sleep too. And so if you're going to devote your time, you have, these 3. And so, what I really felt was that, I could only really devote, like realistically, I could only really devote my time to 2 out of the 3, right? So for example, if you're studying and you want a good amount of sleep, then you're probably sacrificing some kind of, social life. But if you want to study and you want a social life as well too, then probably not going to sleep, that much, or whatever combination that you can think of. And so then, like I said, I did become a believer. This was my 3rd year going into my 4th year in college, and then especially in my 4th year in college, I had to do like everything. And so, of course, I had to study in order to graduate. I was a 4th year. But then I had to lead, when we talk about activities, though, I had to lead the church fellowship, teach many Bible studies, take those 5 classes, have a job, still try to get some sleep somehow, amidst this. And then, it was, at certain points in times, it felt very crazy, but I think something amazing happened as I went along. The more things that I had to do, the busier I had become, God still allowed me to be fruitful and vibrant and grow in Him. And so, this verse came to me. It was like the slave masters, they put more, but then still they multiply, they become fruitful, right? That somehow this was possible. I say this because, that can happen. We are growing in God, but a lot of responsibilities come on us. We think that the world is oppressing us with all kinds of responsibilities, work, family responsibilities, other kinds of things, many buckets, we have to fill. And it seems like quantitative. Like we do some quantitative calculations in our mind that, I can't do everything all at once. It's not as if I can do Bible study and then also and live for God, but while doing, other things, my responsibilities of other things that I have to do in life. But, we need to know that this kind of mentality is really Satan's trick. The fact that he forces us to, put it into quantitative buckets like that, we should remember that God is qualitatively different. It's true that, He will bless us no matter the situation. That's what faith is. It's trusting in God in the midst of everything that is going on. There is everything, and we do need to take care of a lot of things. But even though we have to do a lot of things, God is still going to help us through. There is a way. God helps us along the way. He helps us even in the limited time that we have. For each, He helps even in each time, He helps it grow qualitatively better as well also. And so, that's why it really is just, it's just keeping it, holding on to God no matter what. Right? I mean, how sad would it have been if, these God's people, the Israelites, because of this slave labor and all of these things, it just completely crushed them and boom, it wiped out. But rather, it wasn't like that. They continued to multiply, right? And so, we need to hold on tight, right? I mean, God's people need to hold on tight to our faith in God. And so, for us as well too, even amidst all of the busy things that, we have, it's like, holding on tight, like there's still one main standard that I really need, and that's just really to attend. I need to keep coming. Like if there's service, right, then I need to just be there. I need to be before God, and no matter how busy I am, it's prioritizing before God. And of course, God is going to bless. Right? God is going to bless us in many ways, and so we need to hold on. And so the Israelites, they did hold on. They continued to multiply, but there was still even more oppression, as we read, that came upon them. And so what happens next? So let's go back to Exodus chapter 1, and in verse 15 through 17. So Exodus chapter 1, and in verse 15 through verse 17, it says, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiprah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do, and they let the boys live. And so this is, very, very wicked. The king is unsuccessful. He just wants to put the burdens on them and hope just that the burdens can crush the spirit, can crush, God's people. It can crush our faith in God, our relationship with God. This is how Satan is. But that doesn't work, right? And so, what does the king order? He just orders them to he orders the midwives to outright just kill, right? To just kill the babies, basically, during childbirth. But the midwives, it records here, Shiprah and Puah, feared God, so they didn't do it. Right? They didn't do it. So we need to look at this more deeply, but the first thing I really want to focus on really here is this fear, right? Is this fear. So why isn't it that the midwives, didn't follow the king, right? Why isn't it that they didn't follow the king? Well, it's because they feared God, the Bible records, and so that's why they didn't do it. So if you look here, you really come to find in the Bible, there are two kinds of fear, right? There are two kinds of fear. And so the first type is the fear against the king. Of course the king is fearful. It's the fear against the king, or in other words, what the Pharaoh represents is the world. We've been talking about it in that way, right? So there's the fear against the king and the fear against the world. And then secondly, there is the fear of God, right? The fear of God. So what we need to know about the fear of the king and of the world and the fear of God is that these are two completely different things. I mean, they're the same word. I understand that they're the same word, but the understanding, the spirituality behind that, the heart behind these two words are completely different. They couldn't contrast more. They're really hugely contrasting. Why? It's because the fear of the world, the fear of the king, how is the king? So the kings, especially in those eras, they had all of the power, right? And so with just one word of the king, it would be, they could chop off the head. I mean, you're gone, right? I mean, that's how powerful the king was. And so if you think about it from the concept of the world, right? I mean, just measurably, quantitatively, you could see the almighty king who with one order could chop off the head of these very lowly midwives. It seems like a huge contrast when it comes to their power. And so because of the contrast in power, you would, of course, fear the world, right? Because of that contrast in power. But what we need to see as we look at that paradigm is the fear, right? So why would then the midwives, or why would any of us fear the king or the world or whatever in that way? Why would we fear? Well, because the king is administering this this authority and this fear with power and control, right? This is how it is happening. So it's with the dread of death. I mean, you're going to die, right? You're going to die. If I'm going to die, then what use is it? And so, with fear and horror and control, I need to follow whatever the king says. And so that is the fear that the king is able to do. He administers it in that way. And so you see the same thing even for us living in this world as well too. The world with its wisdom, using physical power, physical power, money, and influence, forces people to do things and be controlled in the system and in these ways with fear and this type of dread, this type of horror and this dread. It's that kind of fear. When you think about it, fear, horror, dread, it has this great power of control. It's there. I mean, it's to say it's not there would be naive. It is there. I mean, think about it. I mean, there was an author, Viktor Frankl. He was a Holocaust survivor. He said the Nazis were like this. The Nazi camp guards, even they actually, this is what he could tell because he interacted with all the Nazi camp guards. Even they were actually could see the horrors and atrocities that they were doing in these concentration camps, but they still followed, and he was analyzing the psychology of it, and it's because even them, they had fear and horror and dread, and so because of the fear and horror and dread, the atrocities that they were committing was just basically normalized, right? They became numb to this because they became, the numbness to this was because of the fear, horror, and dread of keeping them in line. And so, you look at it even from long ago, decades ago, in that, where, because of fear, horror, and dread, these things become normalized. But you see the same thing now. You might think, well, we're not in that era, but it's the same thing now. There are governments, there are people of authority, there is society who control us, control what we say, how you say it, and what we do, and how we do it. And how are we controlled? It was with horror and dread. And it becomes normalized. Because of horror and dread, keeping people in line like this becomes normalized. And so you really come to find this as you grow up in the world. Like it's not as if, we do things or we say things because we really honestly in our heart believe them. But, we're making decisions or we're doing things or we're saying things because of what we fear other people are going to think, what society is going to think about us, what might happen to me, right? It's out of the horror and dread of this world that things become normalized, right? The things, the actions, the decisions, and my thoughts become normalized because of this horror and dread. Why do I go after a certain job or do a certain thing? I'm enslaved to money and fear what will happen to me if I don't have that. Or, what will society think? What will my friends and family think? All of these kinds of things, it prevents us from going to God. So, we really come to find that there is this type of fear, right? So there's this word fear, but there's this feeling of horror and dread behind it that normalizes things in ways that we really don't have. Our heart is not free. It doesn't really want to be there, but it becomes normalized in that way. And so there is that one type of fear, but like I said, there's two types of fear. So the same word, but there's this whole other, it couldn't be more separate. It's really, really different and separate. This whole other fear, right? And what is that fear? That is the fear we have for God. Right? That's the fear we have for God, and this is much different. Let's look at Proverbs chapter 9, and in verse 10. So Proverbs chapter 9, and in verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So it's the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Meaning there's this whole other side. So, we use the same word, right? But there's this whole other side, this whole other heart, this whole other spirituality. And, the starting point, right? It grows, right? It grows into a certain type of fear. But where is that starting point? That starting point is this beginning of wisdom and knowledge of the Holy One, right? And so that's why it's very different. If you look at the beginning point of this other type of fear where there's horror and dread and control and normalization, all of those motivations are also in the world. It is because of money, right? It's because of, some type of expectations of material gains or influence or other kinds of things that we see from the world. That is the starting point of it. But the Bible here talks about this fear of the Lord, and the starting point, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This is the first things that come out is the beginning of wisdom and the knowledge of the Holy One. So it's wisdom, right? It's wisdom and knowledge of the Holy One, not dread. Right? So there's this other fear, and what comes out of that is dread and horror and, and doing things we don't want to do. And then there's this other fear, this other type of fear, the spirituality behind fear, and we get wisdom and the knowledge of the Holy One. And so, what's different about the fear of God? Well, the main difference about this fear of God is because of God, right? It's because of who God is. God, the Bible teaches us that God is love. And so because God is love, that is why, fundamentally speaking, even though it's the same word, it's something completely different. It's God who is loving, good, and sovereign, and he is the all-powerful creator God, that when we have faith in him and love him, and we love him with our hearts freely like that, then what happens is that there is this awe and there's this respect, and that's what comes out of it rather than horror and dread. And so, there's one which is a horror, a dread, a controlling type fear, but another is a holy fear. It's free and it's loving and it's really within Him and it's with faith. And so, we come to find that this kind of fear is greater. So the midwives, when we read about their fear, is that they had this holy fear for God, who they saw and they had faith that He is above the Pharaoh. I talked about the power difference between the Pharaoh and the midwives, right? And using that power difference to control with that fear. But in truth, God is eternal, right? And so, whether the Pharaoh is above the midwife like this much or whatever, like this person is above by this much, God is like way up there. It's drastically different. And so the midwives, they had this wisdom because, they had faith that God is greater than this world. But, how many of us have this backwards? So many of us have this backwards. We think the world is still greater than my faith in God, right? And so because we idolize and we worship the world and we worship the things of this world, my faith in God, my devotion, my heart towards God, it takes a back seat, right? It's just something small, right, compared to the responsibility and what I have to take care of in the world. But we have to see that this is foolishness. Really the Bible helps us understand, our hearts already know, in fact, that this is foolishness. God is so much greater than anything in this world. Eternity is so much greater than anything of this temporary world. And so, these great midwives, even those it seemed like they were the powerless ones compared to the Pharaoh, they were wise. They were much wiser beyond this world because they had holy fear. The holy fear for God. They prioritize Him, having Him on our side. And then, let's look at the last part then. So they had this fear. And then, Exodus 1, verse 18 through verse 21. It says, "Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, 'Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?' The midwives answered Pharaoh, 'Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive.' So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, He gave them families of their own." And so here, actually through this passage, we can a little bit understand what happened before. We can go a little bit deeper into what happened before. And so here, the Pharaoh, the Pharaoh's target of course is to kill the babies, but even for him, he's kind of like doing a step-by-step. First of all, to prevent all this, he's going to just put the burdens in slavery and hope that kind of resolves the problem, but it doesn't. They multiply, become even more numerous. And so he's not yet outright going to just kill the babies. That's what he's doing with the midwives here. He does order it later on. He goes step by step later on. He goes a different step later on. This is verse 22. In Exodus 1, verse 22, the Pharaoh gave this order to all these people: "Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." And so he eventually does get into just this outright murder of the children, the babies. He's so very wicked in this way. But here in the middle, right, before he takes that step, we come to see what really he's asking the midwives to do. Well, he's asking the midwives not to, he could just order the soldiers to really kill the babies. That's what soldiers do. That's not really what midwives do. But what he's asking the midwives do is to disrupt the birthing process in some way. It's actually pretty forced, but he's trying to hide it as if it isn't forced, right? And so to mess up somewhere during the birthing process. It's true. Especially long ago. It's very dangerous. It is now even, but long ago the infant mortality rate during the birthing process was so much higher, right? And so there's so many things that could go wrong that with the baby and with the birthing process, it's like, even for me, my 3 children, it's like a really long time. Actually, my first child was a really long time, the birthing process. It's like a whole day. It's like 24 hours. It was like a whole day. The contractions started, and then it was like a whole day before it came out. The second one was less. It was like 8 hours, and the third one, we got to the hospital, and then an hour later, it came out. And so, but anyways, it's like, at least the first one is like a really, really long time, right? And so, during the middle of that, fortunately now with modern medicine, we have a lot of like doctors and scans and things, but they didn't have that long ago. So think about it, there was like a lot of danger that could happen in the process, many things that could go wrong, many things that could happen to the baby. And so, what we come to find is that what the Pharaoh is really asking the midwives to do, he could just he tells the soldiers later on in verse 22, just go ahead and kill the babies. That's not what he's asking these midwives to do. He's saying along the way, disrupt the process, don't allow, these babies to be born alive or whatever. And then so, this is my read of it, as I look at these passages. The Pharaoh, he's a very wicked, sinister. It's just like these wise men coming up with these, clever methodologies or whatever. They did that before with the burdens and all the work, right? It's the same thing, like commit murder without, actually like doing it, at first. And, it's the same thing actually in faith, how Satan disrupts our progress with faith in actuality. And so, in faith, there is this like process, right, where I open up my heart to Jesus, and I really devote my heart to him. I become disciple for him and his kingdom. There's this long process in becoming a person of God. But, in that long process, there's actually like a lot of things that can disrupt the way. This is what the world does, right? It's like this. It's like we're really, studying the Bible well. We're coming to service. We're really devoting our hearts to God. But then suddenly this or that gets in the way. School, job, family, sickness, other kinds of problems. Many, many things, come along the way. As I'm growing well. I'm growing quickly and I'm growing well before God. But all of these things come, along the way. And so, in actuality, as a person is growing in God, no one actually, like, all of a sudden just, like, kills off their faith all at once, right? Now, no, people, it's not like the normal case. I'm sure it happens, but it's not the normal case. No one, normal case isn't that people just say, oh, I want to leave God and I have more important things to do. They don't just, like, outright say it, but what happens is like one by one, like little by little in the process, like disrupting the process, and then, going back to the world, right? And so Satan throws up, roadblocks here and there, slowing down so that people turn away. And so, always it's like that with worldly wisdom. We have many, many good reasons why not to follow God. Something else is I need to pursue. Following God is not convenient for my life. So, instead, once again, we go towards the fear of the world. We ignore, in the process, right? Instead of fearing God, we fear the things of this world. We ignore God, we ignore service, prayer, Bible study. We do things slow, right? We do things slow. Things slow us up. Roadblocks come along the way. But, here, when we look at this wisdom that was given Shiprah and Puah, and so, we read earlier that Shiprah and Puah feared God. And so because they feared God, what happens is that they were given this amazing wisdom from God, right? And so we have to listen carefully. We have to listen closely, what happens and what they say. And so, the Pharaoh's asking them, what's going on here? I ordered you to do this. But, what the Shiprah and Puah say is that, these midwives, it's that, these Hebrew women, he says, they aren't slow like the Egyptian women, right? That's basically what they're saying here, right? They're saying they're too quick. So when they're saying they're too quick, they're saying, they're really not slow. When you here, we see Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. And so they're vigorous and healthy. They give birth too quickly. They're not slow like the Egyptian woman is really what it's being said here. So, it's actually very true, Jesus has a parable about this, the seed that lands on the path, or the ones in the rocky places, or the ones in the thorn, but there's the one in the good soil, right? So, when God's love comes to us, to a healthy person and a healthy church, what will happen is that people are going to grow quickly, right? Too quickly for the world basically to intervene. It's true. If the Bible is the truth, if what we're learning is true, righteous, and good for our life, then why are we stalling? Why are we just waiting? And what are we waiting for? What are God's people waiting for? The wisdom of faith is to just quickly, if it's the truth is the truth, I should just accept it with all my heart, all my soul, and all my mind, to love God, to live for Him, do His will completely. And so, these weak midwives, because they feared God, it allows them to, overcome, right? They could tell the Pharaoh, hey, even before we come to, you've ordered us really to kill these babies, basically to disrupt, somehow so that these babies are killed along in the birthing process. But even before we arrive, the babies are already here, is really what they say. And so because, the Bible is very clear here, because they feared God, He allowed them even to overcome the power of the Pharaoh. They understand that the Pharaoh has this intention behind it, and, how to overcome that intention, He gives, these midwives this wisdom. And so, we really come to find what the Bible says is very true. True wisdom, the true wisdom of the gospel is fearing God. As we fear God, the fear of God, the holy fear, the loving fear of God, if we have God on our side, He will give us the true wisdom to overcome with faith. And so He gave this wisdom to the midwives, and not only did He give them that wisdom, that, they became also very numerous. Right, in verse 20, God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, He gave them families of their own. Right, and so the midwives, because they feared God, they received this wisdom as well too, and then they became fruitful, also multiplied, increased in number, like this. And so, the Bible teaches us the same thing. Who is the source of great blessing and prosperity? The world teaches us about prosperity. It puts us in fear in order to gain prosperity inside of this world. But, it's actually from God. God is the one who is sovereign over all. And so God is the one who blesses us and He allows us to be prosperous, but not from the smart ways of the world, but it's really just in faith. It's in faith that God is the subject, God is the owner and a sovereign over this world, not Pharaoh, not the world. And then so, that question really should come to us. Who do we fear? Who we fear is really who is in our hearts. That's what we really come to find today. Who we fear, that is who is in our hearts, and who we fear is who we worship. And so, are we fearing the things of the world? Then the things of the world are in our hearts, and that's who we worship. But if we fear God, then God is the one. His loving grace is in our hearts, and then we follow Him. And so today, I pray that we can have the holy fear of God, who loves us and is the owner of all of the history, who wishes us for us to be exceedingly prosperous. It seems like everything in my life is out of my control and only in the control of the world, but we need to know that God is sovereign and He's in control of everything, and look to Him for the true wisdom. And then I pray, like the midwives who feared God, that we can help many others towards faith and the will of God. Let's pray. Father, we thank You, Lord, for Your loving grace today, as we have come to study and understand the beginning of this path of Exodus, to walk towards Your kingdom, to walk towards Your will and Your kingdom, towards your promised land, Lord. We see all of the roadblocks that the world puts on its way, Lord. That the world puts many burdens. It puts just a lot of fear, a lot of things to disrupt our process as we're growing in faith, Lord. There's so many things that get in the way, Lord, but we come to find that the only thing we can rely on is not our own ability and the things of this world, Lord, but it's really only you, Lord, to have faith in you, to have faith and to have the loving fear of you, Lord, you who are sovereign over all, you who love us and who blesses us, makes us fruitful, Lord, and we just thank you for your loving grace in our life. Be with us, guide us in everything, and in Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen.